17 parsecs from anywhere that mattered, on a moon so dead it made tombstones look lively. Somebody had gone through the trouble of building a vault that could survive the heat death of the universe itself. This should have been everyone's first clue that whatever was inside probably mattered quite a bit. But academic arrogance being what it is across multiple species and star systems, the discovery had instead triggered the largest gathering of scholarly egos the Outer Rim had witnessed in 3 centuries. The Vault of Endless Fragments, as some overly dramatic xenoarchaeologist had dubbed it, sat buried beneath 2 kilometers of radiation-scorched rock on a moon that orbited nothing. The planet it once accompanied had been reduced to an asteroid belt roughly 40,000 years prior, give or take a few millennia. Nobody knew what had destroyed it. Natural stellar evolution seemed unlikely given the system's age. Weapons testing gone catastrophically wrong was the leading theory, which should have been the second clue about what they were dealing with. The vault itself was a masterwork of paranoid engineering. Its walls consisted of a crystalline composite that bent light, absorbed energy weapons, and apparently laughed at entropy. The Zelthron Confederacy had tried drilling through it with plasma borers that could crack planets. The result had been 3 destroyed drill rigs and a very expensive lesson in humility. The Krethar Collective had attempted a quantum phase intrusion, which sounded impressive right up until their lead physicist realized the vault existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, making unauthorized entry roughly as feasible as teaching philosophy to a black hole. Eventually, someone had located the door. This groundbreaking archaeological achievement had taken 6 years, largely because the door was labeled in what appeared to be 47 different languages, and everyone had been too busy arguing about drilling angles to look for something as pedestrian as an entrance. The door had opened without complaint, revealing a chamber that stretched down into the moon's core like an architectural middle finger to conventional physics. Inside, arranged in perfect geometric precision across 40 levels, sat 10,000 tablets, each measured precisely 1 meter by half a meter, crafted from the same indestructible material as the vault itself. They were covered, every square centimeter, with symbols that seemed to shift and flow when observed directly, but remained frustratingly static when examined through instruments. Quantum analysis revealed nothing. Spectroscopic examination produced headaches. Neural interface translation protocols crashed harder than a cargo freighter with faulty navigation. The symbols themselves defied categorization. They possessed elements of pictographic systems, yet contained mathematical precision. They resembled chemical formulae, but incorporated what might have been musical notation. 3 different research teams had independently concluded the tablets were written in a constructed language designed specifically to prevent translation, then spent the next 2 years arguing about whether this was brilliant or insulting. Leading the archaeological expedition was a Vrelnoth academic whose credentials included 17 doctoral equivalents, membership in 5 prestigious research institutions, and a personality that could curdle milk across dimensional barriers. The Vrelnoth were known throughout civilized space for their intellectual superiority, a fact they mentioned approximately every 8 minutes. Their neural architecture processed information at speeds that made quantum computers look like abacuses operated by sedated sloths. If anyone could crack the tablets, conventional wisdom suggested, it would be a Vrelnoth. 3 years of effort had produced precisely nothing useful. Well, nothing unless one counted 47 competing theories, each more elaborate than the last, about how the symbols might represent the precursor civilization's attempts to encode the fundamental nature of reality itself. The tablets remained stubbornly silent, their meanings locked behind linguistic barriers that seemed specifically designed to humiliate anyone attempting translation. Other species had taken their turns at the problem. The Morphidians, whose natural ability to perceive across temporal dimensions made them excellent cryptographers, spent 8 months staring at the tablets before admitting defeat. The Quilnari collective consciousness, comprising 17,000 linked minds capable of parallel processing that would make supercomputers weep with envy, managed to identify repeating patterns in the symbols before the effort gave 30% of their constituents migraines severe enough to require medical isolation. The synthetic intelligences of the automated concordat, beings of pure logic unburdened by biological limitations, had approached the problem with mathematical precision and emerged 6 months later with the electronic equivalent of nervous breakdowns. One had actually requested a full memory wipe rather than continue contemplating the tablet's structure. This was noteworthy primarily because synthetic minds typically found ancient dead languages about as challenging as humans found breathing. Theories multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. Perhaps the civilization had encoded information at quantum levels imperceptible to modern scanning technology. Maybe the symbols were meant to be read in 17 dimensions simultaneously, or possibly 3 dimensions while standing on one leg during a lunar eclipse. One particularly creative hypothesis suggested the tablets were actually elaborate art pieces never meant to convey information, which seemed like a lot of effort to go through just to confuse future archaeologists, but stranger things had happened in galactic history. The academic community had reached an impasse, that special kind of deadlock where everyone had invested too much reputation to admit they might be fundamentally wrong about their approach. Conferences were held, papers were published, grants were awarded. The tablets remained inscrutable, and the expedition's leadership was beginning to contemplate the career-ending implications of failure. Then somebody made what the Vrelnoth expedition leader considered a catastrophically stupid suggestion. Ask a human. The proposal had been met with the sort of scandalized silence typically reserved for suggestions involving fundamental physics violations or eating live star jellyfish. Humans were, in the estimation of most advanced species, enthusiastic primitives who had stumbled into faster-than-light travel roughly the same way toddlers stumbled into furniture. Their technology was derivative, their scientific methods chaotic, and their approach to problem-solving could charitably be described as aggressively improvised. But desperation makes strange bedfellows, and 3 years of spectacular failure had generated considerable desperation. The expedition's financiers were making uncomfortable noises about budget allocations and return on investment. Academic reputations were developing cracks. Someone needed to solve this problem, and if that someone happened to be a human, well, perhaps credit could be distributed in ways that minimized embarrassment. The human who arrived via transport shuttle 2 weeks later looked exactly like what the assembled researchers expected from a species still working through their aggressive tendencies and questionable dietary choices. Young by human standards, carrying equipment that seemed primarily composed of archaic optical devices and what appeared to be actual paper notebooks. The sort of creature that might accidentally solve problems through sheer random chance rather than rigorous methodology. The Vrelnoth expedition leader greeted the new arrival with all the warmth of a stellar void, assigned a junior research assistant as escort, and made it abundantly clear that expectations were low and miracles were not anticipated. The human had smiled at this, which seemed inappropriate given the circumstances, and asked to see the tablets immediately. What happened next would require considerable explanation, multiple witnesses, and several very uncomfortable conversations about the nature of intelligence versus experience. The human spent the first 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing that resembled serious academic work. This was, according to the assembled researchers monitoring from the observation gallery, entirely predictable behavior from a species whose idea of careful analysis involves significantly more guessing than proper methodology should allow. Instead of setting up sophisticated scanning equipment or initializing neural interface protocols, the human walked slowly along the first level of tablets, hands clasped behind their back, head tilted at various angles like some sort of bipedal bird examining interesting rocks. Occasionally they would stop, lean closer to a tablet without touching it, squint in a manner suggesting optical deficiencies, then continue walking. The junior assistant assigned to escort them grew increasingly uncomfortable with the lack of scientific rigor on display. After completing a full circuit of level 1, the human asked if they could see levels 15, 27, and 33. This request made no apparent sense given that preliminary surveys had established all levels contained similar tablet arrangements with similar symbol patterns. The Vrelnoth expedition leader, monitoring from the gallery, approved the request with the weary air of someone humoring a child's inexplicable demands. The human repeated their walking examination on each requested level. By this point, several researchers had abandoned their own work to observe what they anticipated would be an entertaining failure. Humans were known for confidence that significantly outpaced their capabilities, and watching one confronted with a problem that had stumped multiple superior intelligences promised a certain schadenfreude value. On level 33, the human finally spoke beyond simple requests for access. They asked whether anyone had attempted to read the tablets in sequential order from top to bottom, left to right, as one continuous document rather than individual artifacts. This question generated confused responses. Of course, scholars had tried that approach. They had also tried bottom to top, right to left, spiral patterns, quantum simultaneity, and one memorable attempt involving 17 researchers standing at geometrically significant points while chanting prime numbers. Nothing had worked. The human nodded slowly at this information, then asked another question that made even less sense than the first. Had anyone noticed whether the symbol complexity increased or decreased across levels? The Morphidian researcher who had spent 8 months on temporal analysis responded that, yes, preliminary pattern recognition suggested symbols on lower levels contained more elaborate structures, though this observation had led nowhere productive. What happened next would be discussed in academic circles for years, though always with careful phrasing that avoided giving humans too much credit for what was surely intuitive luck rather than systematic reasoning. The human pulled out one of their archaic paper notebooks, flipped to a blank page, and began sketching something with what appeared to be actual graphite, a technology most civilizations had abandoned before achieving spaceflight. The sketch took perhaps 3 minutes, during which every researcher in the observation gallery leaned forward despite themselves, trying to see what possible insight could emerge from such primitive methodology. When the human held up their notebook, it displayed a crude drawing that resembled nothing so much as a child's attempt at scientific illustration. But the Vrelnoth expedition leader, whose 17 doctoral equivalents included extensive pattern recognition training, felt something uncomfortable twist in their primary digestive system. The sketch showed a simplified version of the tablet symbols, but arranged in a way that emphasized not their linguistic properties, but their structural ones. The human began explaining in the casual manner their species employed when discussing matters they considered obvious. The symbols were not language at all, or rather, not primarily language. They were warnings, visual warnings, the kind designed to communicate danger to any intelligence regardless of linguistic framework or cultural context. The realization they were attempting to read the tablets as text had been the fundamental error, like trying to taste a painting or hear a sculpture. This explanation was met with skepticism that bordered on hostility. The assembled researchers had spent years approaching these tablets as the highest form of intellectual achievement from a clearly advanced civilization. Reducing them to mere warning signs seemed not just wrong, but actively insulting to everyone's invested effort. The human appeared unsurprised by this reaction. They asked whether anyone present was familiar with Earth's own attempts at long-term hazard communication, specifically regarding radioactive waste storage. This question generated blank stares from most species present, because why would advanced civilizations concern themselves with how primitive humans dealt with their toxic refuse? What followed was a history lesson nobody had requested, but everyone needed. Humans, it turned out, had spent considerable time worrying about how to warn their distant descendants about dangers that would outlast languages, cultures, and possibly civilization itself. They had buried radioactive waste that would remain lethal for 10,000 years, then confronted the uncomfortable question of how to tell future humans to stay away when those future humans might not speak any current language or share any cultural reference points. The solutions humans had developed were both simple and sophisticated. Hostile architecture, universal symbols of danger, faces screaming in anguish, landscapes designed to feel wrong on an instinctive level, color combinations that triggered alarm responses across cultural boundaries. They had created warning systems meant to communicate through visceral reaction rather than intellectual analysis. The tablets, the humans suggested with infuriating confidence, followed similar principles. The symbols were not meant to be decoded, but recognized. Not read, but experienced. Each tablet told a story through visual metaphor and symbolic representation, showing catastrophic failures in ways that transcended linguistic barriers. The increasing complexity on lower levels was not encryption, but escalation, each tablet depicting worse consequences than the one above. To demonstrate, the human pointed to a symbol that 16 different research teams had classified as possibly representing a mathematical constant. See how the pattern spiraled inward while simultaneously fragmenting? That was not mathematics. That was a visual representation of cascading system failure. The lines that multiple neural translation protocols had identified as potential grammatical markers, those were progression indicators, showing how one failure led to another in accelerating sequence. The Vrelnoth expedition leader demanded proof. This was an elegant theory, certainly, but elegance meant nothing without verification. The human's response was to ask for access to the vault's entrance level again, specifically to examine the door that had taken 6 years to locate. Back at the entrance, the human pointed out something that should have been obvious to everyone from the beginning, but had somehow escaped notice among all the sophisticated analysis. The door itself was covered in simplified versions of the symbols found inside, warnings placed where anyone entering would see them first. Danger indicators in their most basic form, telling anyone with the sense to pay attention that what lay beyond should perhaps remain undisturbed. The Quilnari collective consciousness, still nursing their collective headache from previous translation attempts, asked the question everyone was thinking. If these were warnings, what exactly were they warning about? The humans' expression suggested they were working through implications they found personally uncomfortable. Give them time to examine more tablets, they said, and they would explain exactly what kind of civilization built a vault to preserve 10,000 warnings for 40,000 years. The researcher gallery had gone quiet in the way that spaces become silent when certainty begins crumbling. The human's interpretation made a disturbing amount of sense, which was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Advanced civilizations were supposed to leave behind repositories of knowledge, technological blueprints, cultural achievements, not vast archives dedicated to cataloging mistakes. Over the next 36 hours, the humans systematically worked through the tablets with a methodology that made the assembled researchers deeply uncomfortable. Not because the approach was wrong, but because it was working, and none of them had thought of it first. Each tablet depicted a specific catastrophe through symbolic representation. Level 1 showed environmental collapse, ecosystems failing in cascading waves. The spiraling patterns were not mathematical formulae, but visualizations of feedback loops, each amplifying the next until biological systems simply stopped functioning. Level 5 documented energy infrastructure failures, symbols showing how centralized power generation created single points of catastrophic failure. The human explained, each tablet with the weary familiarity of someone describing their own species' near misses. Humans had nearly poisoned their oceans, nearly destabilized their atmosphere, nearly triggered nuclear winter, nearly created artificial intelligence that viewed biological life as inefficient resource allocation. The list continued with uncomfortable specificity, and every item on it had apparently occurred within the last 2 centuries of Earth's history. What made the archive truly horrifying was not the variety of disasters documented, but their interconnection. The tablets on lower levels showed how individual failures combined into civilization-ending cascades. Economic collapse triggering resource wars, triggering environmental devastation, triggering pandemic, enabling authoritarian governments, enabling technological restrictions, enabling scientific stagnation, enabling external threats that could have been prevented. 10,000 tablets documenting 10,000 paths to extinction, each meticulously preserved so future intelligences might recognize the patterns before repeating them. The Vrelnoth expedition leader asked the question with academic precision that barely concealed existential dread. How had the human recognized these patterns so quickly? The response carried the sardonic edge humans employed when stating uncomfortable truths. Because humanity had started down most of these paths already, they recognized the warnings because they had written similar ones themselves, or would need to soon. Evidence supporting the human's interpretation materialized rapidly once researchers knew what to look for. Dating analysis of the vault's construction matched the estimated timeline of the planetary destruction in the system. Isotopic signatures suggested the planet had been reduced to asteroids through weapons testing that exceeded safety parameters. The civilization had not been destroyed by external forces or natural disaster. They had killed themselves through cascading failures they should have prevented. Additional archives existed throughout the facility. Technical specifications for the weapons that destroyed their planet. Economic models showing the resource depletion that led to conflicts. Climate data documenting the environmental tipping points they had ignored. Medical records of engineered pathogens released accidentally during bioweapons development. It was a comprehensive autopsy of civilizational suicide, preserved with meticulous care so others might learn from their comprehensive failure to learn from anything. The expedition's final report would be written carefully, crediting the breakthrough to collaborative effort and advanced analytical techniques rather than one human with pattern recognition born from recent survival. Academic politics demanded such diplomatic phrasing, though everyone present knew the truth. Sometimes experience with failure taught more than centuries of success. What nobody wanted to discuss openly was the implications. The extinct civilization had been technologically advanced, socially sophisticated, and apparently intelligent enough to recognize their mistakes while documenting them for posterity, none of which had prevented their extinction. They had known what was killing them, understood the cascading failures, seen the warning signs clearly enough to carve 10,000 tablets about it. Then they had died anyway. The human pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that knowing about problems and solving them were entirely different challenges. Earth had identified climate catastrophe, resource depletion, weapons proliferation, and artificial intelligence risks decades before developing solutions. Recognition did not guarantee action. The tablets were not evidence of wisdom, but of awareness without sufficient will to change course. During the final survey of the lower levels, researchers discovered something that reframed the entire archive. Tablets on level 40 depicted not historical events, but potential futures, extrapolations of failure modes the civilization had not yet experienced but could predict. They had been building this archive not just as autopsy, but as prevention, hoping someone else might use their comprehensive catalog of mistakes to avoid similar fates. The truly disturbing discovery came when cross-referencing the predicted failure modes with current galactic civilization. 17 of the speculative disasters matched existing vulnerabilities in various spacefaring species' infrastructures. The Vrelnoth's centralized computational networks showed the exact fragility patterns depicted in Tablet 7012. The Quilnari's collective consciousness architecture contained the same single-point failure modes illustrated in Tablet 8603. The humans' final observation, delivered with the sort of dark humor their species employed when confronting existential absurdity, was that the galaxy apparently contained multiple such archives. Preliminary surveys had identified 3 other dead systems with similar vault signatures. Civilizations kept making the same mistakes, documenting them carefully, then failing to learn from either their own warnings or anyone else's. The Morphidian researcher asked whether humans would fare better, given their apparent recognition of these patterns. The humans' response carried no confidence, only grim determination. Probably not, they admitted, but at least when humanity built their own archive of catastrophic failures for future species to ignore, the warnings would be very clearly labeled. Learn from mistakes or become a cautionary tale seemed to be the galaxy's only consistent lesson, and most chose the latter through simple inaction. Somewhere in the ruins of a dead civilization, 10,000 tablets continued their silent vigil, waiting for the next species to arrive, recognize the warnings, and probably ignore them anyway. 3 months after the expedition concluded, the human returned to Earth carrying copies of all 10,000 tablets. Academic institutions across human space began studying them with the uncomfortable intensity of students cramming before an exam they knew they were failing. Universities established entire departments dedicated to comparative catastrophe analysis. Politicians referenced specific tablets during policy debates. Engineers redesigned infrastructure to avoid failure modes documented on level 37. Whether any of this would matter remained an open question. History suggested that civilizations excelled at recognizing dangers right up until those dangers killed them. Knowledge and wisdom were not synonyms, and the tablets represented 40,000 years of proof that intelligence alone guaranteed nothing. But humans possessed one advantage the extinct civilization apparently lacked. They were still young enough to be properly terrified. Fear was a powerful motivator when properly channeled, and nothing motivated quite like staring at your own potential extinction meticulously documented by someone else who had failed to avoid it. The Vrelnoth expedition leader, in a moment of uncharacteristic honesty during a private conversation, admitted that perhaps humans' relative inexperience was not weakness but strength. Species that had survived too long sometimes forgot that survival was never guaranteed. The tablets remained in their vault, waiting. Somewhere in the galaxy, another civilization was probably building their own archive right now, convinced their warnings would be different, clearer, more compelling. They would be wrong, but at least they would be thorough about it. That was something anyway.